The Aware Project's aim is to balance the public conversation about psychedelics, spread accurate information, and give a new face to psychedelia. We feel that this change will occur through connection and relationship, one individual at a time. We are calling on everyone whose lives have been improved through the mindful use of psychedelics to educate themselves and become ambassadors for the psychedelic experience. Show those around you that people who use psychedelics mindfully cross all social, racial, economic, and political boundaries.
All right, with that, I'd like to introduce Tony Moss. I'm so excited for you to be here.
Thanks. So to introduce my compadres, this is Tete Bero and David Daniel. This chair is great, but it kind of doing this. This would be much more fun for me. So when Ashley contacted me, obviously, as she mentioned, a very important topic in the entheogenic community is the racial divide, and whatever that conversation is. And but I titled the talk, Eagle, Condor, Ayahuasca Today in the Racial Divide. You can't talk about ayahuasca without, at this point, talking about the Eagle Condor prophecy. You can't talk about the Eagle Condor prophecy without talking about ayahuasca. And in that conversation, what automatically comes up is a conversation about race and culture. So we're going to connect those dots in the first part of what I want to present, but I mostly want to have a dialogue, a conversation. So after I kind of lay out the parameters of the subject matter, then we do more of a Q&A. I'm very curious in hearing all of your opinions and whatever questions come up around that, because we're much more interested in counsel than being talked at, as you all know. And it's my favorite kind of form as well. So for those of you, raise your hand if you have never heard of the Eagle Condor prophecy. Right, just a few. I thought so. So in a very shortened version, some 500 years ago, indigenous people, both here and in South America, saw the colonization in the years of perfect genocide coming. And their elders and spiritual advisors, for lack of a better term, basically said that this time is coming where the Americas are going to split. The eagle representing the north, which also represents the mind, industry, technology, and the condor representing the south, which represents the heart, femininity, and nature. And they said that there would be this great split. And that's why the prophecy is actually very symbolic for this time period that we're in. They were told that 500 years would pass, but then the eagle and the condor would fly together again. And metaphorically and literally, what we're seeing in the world is this actually is taking place. Many amazing thinkers, William Barry, Joanna Macy, quite a few have put forth this idea, including Joseph Campbell, that the only way for humanity to move forward is to bring together the best of indigenous worldview and modern worldview. That we have to find a way to marry the heart and the mind, to marry technology with nature, being in right relationship with both. And either of those things in its polarity doesn't work, and we see that. We just got back from Ecuador, and it was really interesting. David and I went, and we got to spend a week, 10 days-ish with the Secopai, also known as the sequoia. And I got to experience kind of the front lines of what's happening there, that they have had their land through our guy, Jonathan Miller Weisberger, given back to them, demarcated. So now they've got this place that's like considered theirs and recognized. However, there's only 350 of them left. And the kids overall are pretty interested in cell phones and having jobs, right? So this kind of romanticized idea about following the indigenous way, that worldview, and returning to nature, they've got their land back. The reality of it is that most indigenous people don't want to suffer, right? And life is hard living that way. That's why a lot of us don't do it, right? So finding some balance, like how do we bring nature and that connection, right relationship, to the West, and bring appropriate technology, up in this case the North, and appropriate technology to the South and marry the two. Conceptually, humanity moving forward, it works too. This whole idea, this kind of an undercurrent of, I think, current spiritual conversation, which is bringing the heart and the mind together, that's also eco-condor, right? Literally finding a way to marry our intellect with our heart, which would automatically include, as Joseph Campbell said, this new story. And this new story in the mythology would have to be a new consciousness that is embedded in ecology, embedded in being in right relationship with the earth, which is another concept we get from indigenous people. Right? So that's the eagle-condor prophecy in a nutshell, basically, how that works and why. You'll hear more about it. There's several documentaries that are in the works, including one we're working on. And it really does beautifully explain, it gives context for this time period that we find ourselves, basically, in history. So ayahuasca and how it connects to that. If this new story, right, this mandate that we have to marry the heart and the mind together, what it requires for that to happen, in my experience, is literally hitting the reset button. You know, most people are in, for lack of better terms, a trance, right? And we know this to be true. And the Pachamama Alliance, if you're familiar with their work, they talk about this a lot. There is this trance that people get into, whether it's the trance of you and your partner in your dynamic, the trance of the family dynamic you find yourself in, the trance of a particular culture, yeah, that you come out of, and certainly a kind of nationalist trance. You know, well, the Pachamama Alliance, with their work with the Achuar people, basically call that the dream of the West, right? That we have all been fed this dream, this idea of upward mobility, every person can fulfill, you know, their highest ambition and calling, that every one of us can have our own house and a nice car and a yacht, whatever it is. And the reality, we all know that's unsustainable, right? It's impossible for everybody to have this dream. But that's still the dominant dream. Within that dream, there are a lot of unexamined assumptions. You know, one of them is that we are the people that are bringing democracy and freedom to the world, right? You're in this room, you're smart enough to know better, right? But I tell you, me growing up as a kid, I remember really somewhere around like 18, 19 years old, finally starting to kind of get alternative news. And I remember like being really devastated. I thought, this can't be true. My government has my back. We're like the good guys. We're bringing democracy to the world. And I was really shocked, you know, and kind of devastated to find out that in reality, it was kind of in the belly of the beast, you know. And what I mean by that is, you know, democracy as practiced, not conceptually, and capitalism as it actually is practiced, not in its concept, that is now the major idea being exported all over the world. And where initially was happening through genocides and colonization, it's happening now mainly through economics, right? But it's still, the underlying premise is the same. Like, you have something that we want, and this is how we're going to take it. And we've just gotten very sophisticated at doing it and kind of keeping out of the headlines. That's the only thing that shifted, right? So, this trance, you know, it's like, in order for this higher consciousness to evolve, we have to, one, break the trance, right? And then when that trance is broken, it's like, wow, I can now see what I haven't been seeing before. You somehow have to enter a new possibility, you know, which a lot of people are calling the new story. You could even say in relative terms to ayahuasca, a new operating program, right? So that's where ayahuasca comes in. Isn't it interesting that right at this time, when humanity is racing towards the edge of a cliff with gusto, you know, and what we need is this reconnection to Earth, reconnection to each other, just a sense of reconnection in general, that ayahuasca comes out of the jungles right at this time and starts to exponentially expand, right? It is absolutely considered almost the vanguard of this Eagle Condor prophecy. You know, that right at this time period, a technology, which is what it is really, and a modality that was brought forth by indigenous people is becoming very quickly the most popular spiritual modality in Western culture. Almost globally, there's a lot of countries that just kind of haven't even heard of it yet. So we'll just say Western culture. I mean, your next two talks are ayahuasca, right? Is that what you're sharing? Yeah, for the integration? Yeah. And for good reason, you know, ayahuasca does what? Hits the reset button, right? Quite literally. In that space, there is a recognition of interconnectivity, deep connection to Amazonia and Mother Nature in general. High probability that you can and will have a new operating system, right? Usually facilitated by whichever circle you find yourself in. So it really is answering the call, I feel, of the West. I feel what we need most at this time period is something like ayahuasca, not only the medicine itself, which is a great mystery, which we can talk about. I feel like most of you are pretty up on that. But the return to ceremonial practice. When I started doing ceremony work, I've been working with ayahuasca 22 years, by the way, and maybe midway through that, started to get the hint that I would probably want to start leading ceremony, not with ayahuasca, just in general. And in researching that, what I found was really interesting, like the origins of ceremony and why it's so valuable. In cultures all across the world, it's in ceremony where the values of a culture are shared and to some degree received, right? It's in ceremony that there is kind of a cultural programming, right, that young people come to and they find out, these are the values of my community, these are my origin stories, typically oral. And there's a sense of connectivity and belonging to one's history, culture, and place through ceremony, which many people have argued is what we're missing in the West. Rites of passage in the West right now look like graduating from high school and now you can legally go get drunk. Like, face it, that's like, woohoo, you're an adult now. So after you, buy the car, smash it, and get drunk, please go vote. That's pretty much what it comes down to. There aren't any very significant. There are within some of these subcultures in the United States, but overall, those very important moments of transition, certainly from middle school into high school into adulthood, indigenous cultures recognize the value of that recognition, and of you actually entering, it's like you are now considered an adult in this particular culture. That comes with certain responsibilities and expectations, and here's what they are. Right? And by the way, here's where you come from, here's what we consider valuable in our community. Everything from how to hunt so you don't deplete resources, which, relatively recently, anthropologists figured out that indigenous people, including Native Americans, were all practicing land management. They thought they were just kind of living blissfully on the land and roaming. No, they had very sophisticated land management practices, which is showing up now in the West as permaculture. Right? And sustainable design. Well, most of it is based on indigenous practices, right? So again, we see this beautiful marriage of Bero Condor. And if we could bring the technology of the West, everything from alternative energy sources to, probably things that just make labor a lot less intensive, marry that with indigenous wisdom of land management, and then we have this magic combination. So ayahuasca, for me, is one of these technologies, right? The ceremony of being in an ayahuasca, I say being in a ceremony that has ayahuasca as its base, as the sacrament, it offers all those things in the same place. As I mentioned, not only your personal healing, but this sense of connectivity, the intelligence and wisdom that's coming through the songs, let alone the phenomenon of the ayahuasca experience, this sense of connectivity to other people. Generally, communities are formed around ayahuasca circles and they work together, so you have spiritual community. And inevitably, with very little variation that I've seen, there gets instilled this sense of responsibility and connection to Mother Nature, quote unquote, in general, and certainly to Amazonia. Right? So in all of that, our topic for tonight, laying the foundation for that, the fascinating thing for me over the last 22 years is like, where are my people? Right? Right. And it's like me going to my first rave. I'm like, this is fantastic. Where are my people? Then I go to my first massive rave, which ironically David went to years later. His first rave also. It's called Together as One. 30,000 screaming people, and I'm like, where are the black people? There's some Mexicans for sure. Definitely some Asians. And then I go to my first Burning Man, one of the most enlightening, transformative experiences of my life. And once again, there is a question. It's like, where are my people? So I kind of delved into that, and that's what I'm going to lay out why I think there is this racial divide, and then we're actually going to open up a conversation based on everything I've basically put into work as like our framework. There is a reason why we don't see more black people involved in the entheogenic community. The first one is that it's taboo, and it's taboo not in the way that it's taboo for white people. African American communities have been destroyed by drugs, and we're talking drugs, not psychedelics or entheogens. And we now know that those drugs were systematically, consciously introduced to those communities, by our government, basically. Along with that, we had a whole slew of movies, those of you that are old enough to remember them, particularly in the 70s, that were like Superfly, right? And this whole genre of movies that were all about kind of black alike, but they had a common denominator. There was always a dope dealer, there was always hookers, hoes, right? Yeah. And there was always heroin addicts, or equivalent of. So we have this taboo within our culture that, both that image of black people and drugs, and the fact that drugs, in the classic sense of that term, have destroyed most African American communities, and the vast majority of people of color, all people of color, the vast majority of them are in prison for drug-related offenses, right? Which we all know don't belong there. So it's very difficult in a community like that to separate this concept of drug, psychedelic, entheogen. It's basically all the same. It's bad news, right? The interesting thing about that is this concept of right relationship, and this conversation can't happen without the concept of right relationship. And what we mean by that is literally being in right relationship with plant substances, right? With plant medicines, we call them. All the plants that I've seen have this interesting phenomenon, which is they have a dual nature. Opiates in and of themselves, beautiful, and were medicines. Opiates taken to the extreme, heroin, right? Crack, right? So we see the opposite side of being, the shadow side of not being a good relationship. Bupacho used all over North America, South America. In the West became these hybridized, slowly genetically modified cigarettes that kill people. Okay? So something that is considered one of the grandfather of all herbs, that some cultures even believe tobacco as part of their origin story, gave them ayahuasca. In the West, all of those things are commodified, abused, become addictions, and wreak havoc on our health. Ganja, same thing. Beautiful plant ally when used in right relationship. Out of balance. We all know it's like lethargy and lack of motivation, and can destroy relationships, and we've seen that happen. So in the communities that I've moved in the last 22 years, as I've started doing this work, this is a conversation that comes up all the time. There is no spokesperson or information or visibility of the distinction between psychedelics, drugs, and entheogens. And certainly nothing about the idea of right relationship, because you're not seeing it anywhere. Right? So I think that's the main reason that there is a divide. The second is the obvious one. It's what I opened up this section with. When black people go to events where other black people are not at, they just, subconsciously it's like, maybe this isn't where I go. My people aren't hanging out here, it's not popular to us. I feel strange, I can't relate, whatever the story is, that's the other reason. So it's why when I got asked, 4 or 5 years ago to do the ayahuasca monologues, and I said yes. I remember at that time I was beginning to have this conversation, and I thought, black people need to see black people talking about ayahuasca. It's crucial. Why is it crucial? Because one of the main things that ayahuasca heals, those of you that are familiar with, is ancestral trauma. There's now research that started with Marcus and Pembrey out of England, I believe, that has proved, so it seems, that all of us are carrying in our DNA and our genes the ancestral traumas of our ancestors. And the research, I think it's a whole PBS documentary on that, so you can look at the details yourself. But from their research, a research team here took rats and induced these traumas. And then, of course, they bred them. And then 7 generations later, the mice that were born were experiencing symptoms of the same traumas as their parents. So they were able to prove that the traumas, at least the dis-eases related to them, we all carry, we're susceptible to them. So what happens in an ayahuasca ceremony is your ancestral shit comes right up. We all know. Initially it's like my mother, then you're dealing with your grandmother, and all of a sudden there's all kinds of things happening, and like there was this war, I was like by the river, like there was a baby floating, and then it's like all the ancestral stuff comes up. So what two cultures in the United States have most suffered, ancestral trauma? Obviously, it's going to be African Americans and Native Americans. Still suffering, right? To some degree, genocide. There's been many books written now that slavery became Jim Crow laws and lynchings, and those turned into the prison system, basically. So we're still basically dealing with young black men, particularly, in the same way we always have. Now it's institutionalized and it's systemic. Same thing still happens with Native Americans. You know, we're still bringing up the South Dakota pipeline. That is a treaty being broken, right? There's no way around it, right? Once again, we've never honored a single treaty, not one. They've looked at them. And we're looking basically at this same pattern over and over again, that we're still looking at colonization and its method of genocide and silencing. So what I am really excited about, wrapping this up, was a few years back, I was invited to a ceremony, and I didn't know at the time this was taking place worldwide. This is 2012. And the year before that, a good friend invited us to a ceremony that was called Eagle Condor, and I'd never heard of it. But at the time, I was a member of the Santo Daime Church, so I just went because it was going to be, badass. So we go, and it was a Santo Daime ceremony, and then there were all these chiefs there and a few women. And in the middle of our ceremony, they handed over the ceremony to these Native American chiefs, and they played the water drum and sang their peyote songs, and it was an amazing experience. At the end of that ceremony, they stood up, the chief representing all of them, and the granddaughter of this guy Parker, I forget his first name, who was responsible. He's the guy that brought peyote to the Native Americans. As you know, it actually comes from Mexico. And he said, I think this is going to help your people through this suffering. So that medicine he brought, how to use it came from the legend of the White Buffalo Woman, including the teepee and the pipe ceremony, which is basically the Eagle Condor prophecy as well, by the way. She also said, you're going to go through this period, your spirits are going to leave, 500 years later, they're going to return. A Mayan prophecy, same, and all landed in 2012. So all over the world, there are these cultures recognizing that a very significant shift was about to take place. So at the end of our ceremony with these Native Americans, the representative of all the tribes, the NSA stood up and he said, I want you to know that we came here today because we are acknowledging that although peyote is our traditional medicine, it's not curing our people of addictions. And we've heard about this ayahuasca, that's in the context of this Eagle Condor, so we're here to basically check that out. And we want you all to know that we're going back to the councils and reporting ayahuasca's good medicine. So that was the beginning of this prophecy as it literally brought together the foundational indigenous cultures of the North and the South. And since then, there's been a lot of both Native American crossover. We have been in ceremony in South America with people from literally all over the world that have heard this prophecy and are now kind of participating in that. Right? So with that, what I want to do is open up a conversation so that we can just talk. You can field questions, and depending on what they are, I will certainly answer. But from a youth perspective, David and also Tete has a lot of experience working with Shipibo in Peru. We just want to have more of a community council, which is, by the way, a talk is Western, a council is indigenous. Right? There's nothing wrong with a talk, but that's why we want to move it into more of a council, so we can kind of honor that. So let's start out. And by the way, I'm hoping there might be a question that will be appropriate for you to answer. Paulo's here, and he's from Colombia visiting, and also a beautiful medicine man and carrier of tradition. Yeah. I know you're in a university there, or just finished, is that true?
Yes.
Yeah. And what were you studying?
Right now I'm studying film.
Film, great. Yeah, because you're a living representation of the Eagle Condor. Yeah, quite literally, yeah. So, questions, commentaries? I know they're out there. Yes?
Yes. So, I had been out of the psychedelic experience since like the 70s, early 70s. I promise you that in the early 70s, we were all dropping Orange Sunshine and Compton and Watts,
Right.
All over. I don't know what happened, but when I first came back here about a year ago, I was like, what the fuck is going on? Because, it was just very shocking. Our exclusion was very shocking. What is that about? Now, I understand, we got diverted into pleasure seeking and narcotics, and now we all seem, I'm saying black people, have become totally all about high-powered weed and oil and all of that, which doesn't seem to be expanding people's minds based on the culture that's being produced.
Bingo, yeah.
Yeah. But people have no interest. Their only interest is in, this pleasure seeking and reality television and all this fake, false drama, which is not, and you're absolutely right, the epigenetic thing, it's been encoded into our genetic structure, the trauma. And this is the only thing that could possibly heal that. And yet we're not aware of it, and we're not seeking it.
Yeah.
We're not seeking it out. So it's very baffling. It's very baffling.
It's baffling and it's frustrating, and you set up the talk, I think. You set up the talk beautifully, and it is baffling, and it's very frustrating. It's true, I mean, prior to the 70s, when I was talking about that genre of films, we had, the 60s revolution. Black people were certainly involved in that, the beautiful Renaissance. Again, but what we saw was a systematic crackdown on African American communities, let's just say by people in power. So even today, and as you know, white men caught with multiple drugs in a suitcase, get slapped on the wrist, and get a fine. Black men go to jail or worse, right? So this is just the reality of it. So black mothers particularly, certainly when I was growing up, the general message from my aunts who basically, raised me, because my mom was a singer, the general message was, to stay out of trouble at all costs. We have this joke in the African American community, if you don't know, you get pulled over. It's like, oh, what happened? Driving while black. It's a crime in the United States. Yeah, so you sure don't want to be driving, while black and have weed on you, right? Or go to parties where there's substances involved, because that's a perfect excuse. So again, I think overall the origins of the departure from what I think was the beginning of probably right relationship with substances in the 60s. And then through media, as I mentioned, and and the intersection of hip hop culture, to be honest, it's a very fascinating thing. Like, I look back, and for me personally, I feel like the ticket to the American dream for black people was hip hop culture, right? Because all of a sudden, what we have and what we had, everybody wanted, right? And as you know, that very quickly got commodified and sold back to us. The original hip hop was all commentary and wisdom from the streets. Once it got commodified, it became bitches and hoes and drugs celebrated. So again, we saw this relationship with, if weed and other substances were fueling higher consciousness in the 60s and 70s, when hip hop came along, it quickly got turned into what you're talking about. Just a means to party and I think check out. And certainly to escape from, all people of color, the inherent trauma and the reality that we still live in a colonized country and that we're still being persecuted, right? So I think when drugs are used, primarily drugs, as sedatives, or as escapism, then obviously there is no visibility, I think, for drugs, in our case, psychedelics, entheogens, plant medicines being used for healing, right? I can tell you in my family, if I were to go to Oakland tomorrow and give this talk, they'd be like, boy, you crazy. You're just gonna mess around with drugs and end up in jail. That's what's gonna happen to you. So you can't, where does a conversation even begin? Right, so it begins with these kind of talks and visibility. Yeah. In the back?
Well, you kind of just answered my question. How do these talks begin in our community? And you said just having these talks. I see in our community, it's like hip hop is like very controlling over our psyche. Like to the point where we actually think that it is cool and we will be successful if we have this type of car or this type of woman, preferably a light-skinned woman, not a dark-skinned woman. This type of big house and all this money and smoke weed and all this. So the hip-hop community, to me, it's something that I do not listen to anymore because I found like it's really destroying our culture. My family is like nowhere in terms of doing something in their own, in terms of having a purpose in life because of what they listen to, because of what they see on TV. They think that's what they need to be successful, and it's, we've been brainwashed. And
Well, quite literally, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's all these ways, we talked about breaking the trance earlier, and connecting these dots is what we want to talk about, because really if we're talking about racial divide, all of these things interconnect and overlap. We're all under some kind of timing frequency, right? Meaning, wherever your main news source is, whatever your predominant form of entertainment, whatever has your attention the most, you're getting downloaded by that, you know? It's affecting your worldview, right? And everything becomes, without, whether you know it or not, unless you're really, really mindful, you start seeing the world through this particular filter, right? So not only are most white people in America seeing black people through the filter of hip-hop culture, black people now see themselves through the filter of hip-hop culture, which is not being created predominantly by black people, which is really fascinating. Yes, more and more, you know, as you know, it's definitely shifted back. But in general, how it's been commodified and sold, and everywhere we go, I'm telling you, go to, even in Ecuador, and the young kids, they're idolizing hip-hop, you know. So it's interesting, hip-hop culture is now, fascinating enough, synonymous with pop culture, with American culture. You know, which is not surprising, given that jazz was at one time, which also came technically from black people, you know, blues. So I find hip-hop and even ayahuasca use, you know, to some degree now peyote use, these are all things that have been taken from native people, this, you know, dangerous word, appropriated and sold back, right? So the heart and essence of them is missing, at least in terms of how they're viewed in pop culture, not how they're practiced, because they're not practicing anyway, that's why we're talking about it. Yeah. So I'm gonna take one more question and then we're gonna take a pause because we wanna do some other beautiful interactive things with you. Yeah.
Okay, so since media and television, it's so, it's one of the causes why, you know, all of these things are happening. For all of us that are, you know, studying film or filmmakers, what would be the best way to talk about this thing and introduce, you know, from Caucasian side and from white people's side to talk about these things and introduce it to, you know, maybe talk about ayahuasca in a way that is protected and not causing, you know, not causing for that to be destroyed, but also empowered in an empowering way. Like what would be?
Yeah, my answer always to that is tell the truth.
Okay.
Yeah, seriously, what I mean by that is, you know, most of the, even in some of the documentaries, what you're watching are very dramatized ayahuasca experiences. You know, the average person that does their homework, right, and they go on the internet, by the time they come to the ceremony, what they've seen are several documentaries of people having the most far-out dramatic ayahuasca experience possible. So they're ready, you know, like, I'm ready to pick my guts out, you know, I'm going to be screaming and running through the forest, whatever it is. You know, my father's going to appear, you know. Those of you who have had ayahuasca experiences know that those are actually not the norm, right? The most powerful healing experience can be that very subtle moment when you get a correction about your behavior, right? Or suddenly you see the origins of your addiction, right? Or your trauma, your anxiety, depression, and that gets released. You know, that's the beauty and the power of ayahuasca. With that, if you're fortunate, because not everybody has them, it can be accompanied with amazing visionary states that literally connect you with, you know, in quotation marks, the divine, you know, with Gaian consciousness itself, which we call the spirit of ayahuasca. Yeah, it's beautiful in that way, that it's often the more subtle moments that are actually the most healing. But again, in terms of like your question, it's like telling the truth about the ayahuasca experience without the need to dramatize it, and certainly without the need to make it satirical. We've seen several Hollywood films where it's like their ayahuasca experience actually looks like a wild LSD experience. And everybody that knows, the two don't compare at all. You don't take yes, there are some very hysterical moments, right? that happened for sure, that we as a community can laugh about for decades. But it's always happening in the backdrop of a very held sacred ceremony, with very rare exception. So my response is, yeah, be accurate. I don't think you need to romanticize it, nor does it need to be in any way disrespected. Just tell the truth about what it is. That's my response.
So in the film, what? Okay, maybe I don't even know how to ask the question. So, like, if you show like ayahuasca experience like on film, like, is there as far as protecting the medicine and and people that are making the film, people that making the medicine as well, like, what would be the best way to show it without causing?
Well, you have to film it in a place where it's legal.
Okay.
Period.
Like,
Yeah, any place where it's legal, people can be on camera talking about their experience and even give their address where they live because they're doing it where it's legal. Yeah, the only problem you would have in representing ayahuasca in terms of legality is filming it in a place where it's illegal, because now you've indicted everybody related. Right?
What would be the best way to speak about the racial, issues and introduce it to Black communities as well, without?
Yeah, there's only one way to do that. There has to be Black people presenting the information. Period. A white, Chinese, Mexican, whatever it is, person telling Black people, this is really good medicine for you should come try it. That's not going to fly. Yeah, so you've got to have somebody Black, who people can, by the way, identify with as Black, which, by the way, I don't in Black communities. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, having somebody that Black people can relate to, talking just honestly about their experience and what they got from it, would open that conversation up. And when I did the interview with Amber Lyon for her website, Reset Me, that's exactly what happened. I'm still getting messages every month from Black people all over the world saying, I stumbled across this video. I was so excited to hear what you had to say. It made a lot of sense to me. Where can I go? Can you advise a place that's safe? So just in that interview, it opened up the conversation for people of color. Yeah, but they needed to see me talking about it. Yeah. So we're going to take a quick break. One of the things that's very interesting about the ego condor is that this concept of appropriation, this comes up all the time publicly. Like, aren't we just appropriating TP ceremonies or appropriating ayahuasca ceremonies? It's not about who's carrying the medicine. It's the integrity of how it's being carried. And the study, in Tete's case, actually go to Peru, work with maestros, and get their blessing. You don't start leading or sharing ceremonies in Peru, which is where he takes people there occasionally. You can't do that until you have the blessing of a maestro who's firmly rooted in the tradition and says, yeah, I feel like you're ready to do that. Right? That's not an appropriation. That is a sharing, and that's ego condor. Some of the roadmen in the United States for the Native American Church are white. Interesting thing about that is there's a story, and I don't remember its origins, of one of these chiefs, like Sitting Bull, before they're going to be, executed, and they say to the white people, it's like, what you're doing is not going to work. We're going to come back. And not only are we going to come back, we're going to come back as your children. Right? So this is true in so many ways. I mean, ego condor, here I am, the African-American guy. I was raised predominantly in Oakland and Culver City, yet my life is now completely dominated by right relationship, ego condor, and plant medicine. It was more a response to a calling that had to be taken on with a sense of integrity. So in my case, there is no appropriation whatsoever. This was hard won, right? Through a lot of trial and error and study, and permission. Finally going to Peru, sitting with the Shipibo, and them actually saying, you have our kana, you have our protection, you have our blessing, and we consider your group. This is what the Kettles gave us, actually, in the Aymar. They said, we consider the work that you're doing to be alta condor, which is basically blonde condor. Yeah, that you're fulfilling this prophecy, and carrying this medicine in a good way that we approve of. Yeah. So with that, I would like for Tete to share this, so we can lower our heads if we would like, and maybe lower your eyes if it's right for you. You're going to share any Karo. We're going to move a little into a ceremonial space in that case. Can that light be dim? off just in the back.
We'll try.
Tete Bero bewa Akonshama aketa Ayahuasca bewa Plantita bo bewa Plantita bo makebo de mea kap yombano Kapaingi plantita bo medico Tabu medico ani transformation ka Ayahuasca medaya Walk bewa papa pinosito bo bewa bewa makena Make plantita make tanede orayon danede Ani transformation ga ani profecia meabo Aguilita medico Condor sito medico Mepi baingi mepi ondanede Toridito humanity medico Kapayon danede Kepen baingi Rosso medico poderoso sinombo poderoso intebo poderoso yodabo poderoso kayabo hawen sabiduría hawen conocimiento hawen inteligencia mea cap yombano Lita medica mohag medaya irikoi tradition irikoi medico Kanu abano ke kanu abano aguilita medico aguilita perspectiva mea bo mea capa yombano noi divino Hawen luz divino illumina baingi Toredito plantetas libre ondanene Kanyam mobo libre bo marijuana libre medicine tobacco medico libre yondanene shippy bobo medico Bobo arcana africando medico kapan baingi ada bewa ora yontana anatai bane aski tone orani tone lenguabo kapan
So in the spirit of that, which is why I invited Tete to respond to this idea of appropriation. We clearly don't need to be Chichibo to carry the message. Right? I've sat with them and it's not more powerful and better than that. It's just that in a beautiful way. So part of this ego condor is it has nothing to do with, well, it's not true. It certainly has to do with honoring the origins, right, with respect and reverence. But for one of the crucial aspects of this ego condor prophecy is that these indigenous medicines and ceremonial practices have to hit Western people where we're at, right? These ceremonies that have developed both in the United States and in South America have modulated, right, to accommodate Western people, right, and our consciousness. Everything from the strength of the medicine to the style of the ceremony. Certainly, we call them the hybrid ceremonies here. There's been this beautiful reciprocal conversation going back and forth between the tradition, which is happening also with Native American ceremony tradition, and with Western people. If what we're really committed to, which is the team that we're on, the elevation of human consciousness, that's again the ego condor. It's like, how do we take these beautiful indigenous practices and modulate them, you could say update them, so that they really meet Western people where they're at, and we can get the same benefits out of them that the indigenous people of their origins come from. And one of the ways that happens is in ceremony, it's modulating the music, right? One of the things that Western people, particularly young people, get really attached to is going to Peru and they meet whoever their particular teacher is, and that becomes the guy. Like, oh no, man, I found the traditional way.
The best shaman.
Yeah, I think he's the best shaman. He's like really in the tradition, and we're always like, what tradition are you talking about? Since there are so many, even in that region. And this idea of, the Ikados, they frown upon like English being spoken in the ceremonies. Well, if you're Shipibo, you're hearing all those Ikados as English, right? If they're saying, what some of them like the basic translations. I want to give that to you before me. The Tete was a lot of, what do like the bulk of those Ikados translate to? What are they saying?
Well, since we're not in a medicine space, it was inappropriate to open the medicine chant, so it was a prayer chant. And it was basically what Tony's been talking about, the ego condor. This is the prophecy, Ani prophesiable. Ani in Shipibo means his great. It's a very poetic, very ancient language. But every chant is unique. We don't, in the Shipibo tradition, there are village songs, like it's harvest time, everybody come out. But in the healing tradition, there is no songs. It's just what's coming through from spirit at the time. And the vibrations, particularly the make, is what's important. The plants all have a melody that they teach with, a melody and rhythm, each particular plant, and they give 2 songs.
So what has happened also down in South America, but particularly in ceremonies that take place through the Santo Daime, through some of the groups that I've gotten to experience here in the West, is same traditional format, same really beautifully respected reverence for the ceremonial structure. But one of the things that is absolutely ego condor that has shifted is the music. Contemporary devotional music, a lot of music, interestingly enough, Spanish, songs that have become kind of staple Ayahuasca ceremony songs that a lot of groups do. And then, what I call the contemporary devotional music, musicians that come to ceremony that just get hit with the inspiration, the same way that the curanderos do, and songs come through. And those become like the medicine songs of Western culture, which is really interesting. Yeah. So we're going to share one now that's more of a hybrid. It's one of the, for me, prayers that I received in the ceremony that, it gives more of a demonstration, I think, of the how the medicine can hit Western people and utilize whatever it is your musical, cultural background and heritage might be. She never let to me waiting my, she never waiting me, she never waiting my, she. Yeah, so in ceremonies that I occasionally get to facilitate, clearly, there's a sense of ayahuasca, the medicine comes through. And this, we don't have very developed language in the West to talk about things that, Western culture calls woo-woo. Right? But here's the reality of it, the best we can do. There is a sense in an ayahuasca ceremony, when it's potent and the container is held, of you actually communing with the spirit of ayahuasca, which some might interpret as, the Gaian consciousness itself. So you call it your higher self, but it's globally, cross-culturally recognized as a divine feminine spirit, which is interesting. With the exception of maybe like the Sekopai, who's more like grandfather, it's more masculine. But in general, worldwide, it's considered feminine. In that dialogue, things come to you, like the insights and wisdoms, and I remember long before I actually read anything about quantum physics, I was playing this game with myself in ceremony. I thought, okay, if this is real, then I'm going to ask questions I don't know the answers to. Right? So I remember asking ayahuasca these questions about the nature of reality, and right away getting these answers. And then later, reading my first books on quantum physics, going, oh shit, that's exactly what ayahuasca said. Right? Yeah, so in that, for not only artists, but particularly musicians, the same thing happens where suddenly there's an inspiration, and it's literally an experience of you witnessing yourself as an instrument that the medicine is singing through, right? So for me, of course, my heritage, being a musician and having African American roots, rhythm and blues, then oftentimes, occasionally Ikaros come that sound more like traditional ones, and particularly a culture I've been exposed to. But generally, they're more like that. You know?
Some of the people is just, I mean, I've heard some people women sound like Eartha Kitt. I mean, it's just, they just get down. So I don't know what happened cross culturally, or if that's just the plants speaking to us.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that all day long.
Yeah, the music, I wanted to bring that in because a crucial part of ceremony and how it works is basically what the Shipibo say roughly translation, that even though ayahuasca is the true shaman, the curandera, and that's the force, the healing force of the medicine, the music is what tells it where to go, right? The music is what gives the ceremony direction, and can drop in, I think, subconsciously or very consciously, the little thing you need to hear that unlocks whatever that is. You know, there's many times in ceremony where someone heard this one lyric, and they were thinking that right as the lyric came, and suddenly their whole origins of depression and trauma got unleashed in that moment, right? So the music is crucial. So one of the reasons I bring that up is, I can only imagine an ayahuasca ceremony with black people singing gospel music, because it's gonna happen. And how ridiculously powerful that's gonna be. I know, as I've watched it over the years, it's going to work with and through whatever group is there. I'm like, yes, this music is music that's gonna come through. Some of the most beautiful ayahuasca music I've heard is actually from Germany. How do you, I always say his name incorrectly, Rainer?
Scheurenbrand.
What is it?
Rainer Scheurenbrand.
Yeah. That guy. His first album, I believe, is called Jardin. Yeah, it's like one of my also favorite albums of all time. And it sounds distinctly German if you're familiar with that in terms of the musicianship and the kind of musical sensibility, but really goes right to the very core and brings me right into ceremonial space every single time. So that again is this kind of ego condor. It's like, where's the appropriation when in reality, you know, the plant is speaking, you know, to humanity. So next.
I love that there's an evolution of ceremony for Western audiences. I'm curious where you see the evolution of the psychological integration after ceremony for Western audiences. Because I have friends who went to something in Panama where there were a variety of cultures, and it was like they were doing a buffet of medicinal plants with iboga and ayahuasca, and it seemed like not the appropriate type of scenario.
Right.
So I'm curious, where do you see the evolution of integration going? Is it through Western psychology?
Yeah, this is a no. We're in it, we're watching it. You know, literally, we have groups all over the country and over the world forming like the Aware Project, right? One of the things that Western, we'll say the eagle, has brought to the Condor is the concept of integration. I've done a lot of research on it, and it didn't exist prior. And what I mean by that is, the average ayahuasca ceremony you go to today would be followed by a sharing circle, right? Because we now realize the power and the potency and the importance of people being able to make sense of their experience before they just hop on a plane and go back to the West and like, well, now what the fuck? You know? Indigenous people, you know, and excuse me if it's an inappropriate term to use for you, like someone like Paulo, you know, who has embraced traditional ceremonial culture and wisdom, but also attending a university, like, you know, and how do we marry, which we're seeing, the research about what ayahuasca is actually doing in the brain, which we now understand more and more, with what the curanderos, quote-unquote shamans, have been saying all along. Because it turns out they're very synced up, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so I feel that is where we're seeing, how much time do we have? Great. I feel like that's where we're seeing this integration. As I look to the future obviously is going to be legalization in some way. And you said, you know, would it be under psychology? Would it be under pharmacology? I hope not. I hope it's under freedom of religious practice, because it's the only way I think we're going to be able to maintain the right relationship. Yes, in that context. So do you want to speak to Eagle Condor, just what that even means to you? I would like to hear from you. He's embarrassed now, but we're putting you on the spot.
Thank you so much.
Tony, it's really an honor to be here tonight. And yeah, it's amazing to hear you because I know you from many people here.
Yeah.
Many people here when we came to the city and speaking about Tony and your community. It's really an honor to realize how you are leading this process in the north and bringing this integration to this territory, to this land. And it's really an honor to me, like, it's make to me feel like I'm in the right place, because I was wondering why LA, why I'm here, what is happening here, and all the things that are happening, this all the movement, and to see that it's people with respect that are honoring the traditions and are making those bridges that we need, because this is the meaning of the prophecy. It's not, for us, it's very clear that it's not speaking about ayahuasca, and this is the wisdom of the indigenous people. This is a gift to the mankind.
Exactly.
In the myth of the origin, in the tribe where I was studying, they spoke about the origin of the ayahuasca, the vein. We call ayahuasca Yahe, and for us it's the grandfather, it's the Tete Yahe, which is also interesting. And they said that the origin of the vein is when Jesus Christ when he died, and he came back to life, and in those days he doesn't go directly to heaven, so he started to walk around the world, and he went to the Amazon, and when he was walking,
I like this story.
and when he was walking in the jungle, many hairs fell down into the earth, and those hairs are the origin, the vein, the origin. So, and that was so interesting when I started to go there to the jungle and see these elders offering ceremonies, and in the beginning praying our Father, or praying to the Virgin Mary, and I was
confusing, yeah.
What is happening here? It's like an ancient tradition, and you are speaking about the Catholic religion, and they say, why? And I did my research, I studied history by that time, and I went to the jungle to figure out what was happening. And the thing is that they was looking through the medicine, the spirit of Jesus, like the unification spirit.
Right.
You know, it's the same as the Condor evil.
Yep.
And they said we didn't meet Jesus Christ through the conqueror, because we already knew him through the medicine, through the ayahuasca. They are not fighting with this is something imposed to us, it's something that we are living, realizing, and the message is the same message of all the creatures, all the tribes. It's that we need to unify.
Yeah.
Unify. This is the same language in all the world that is taking us to the same place, that we are going all as human beings. And this is part of the prophecy, how we realize that.
It's so beautiful. I'm so glad you came. I didn't know that story. That's a new one, and I love it. Because the Santo Daime is very similar. If you don't know, the Santo Daime is an ayahuasca church out of Brazil, but it's Judeo-Christian. You know, you drink what they call daime, which is ayahuasca, made differently. So it's christened as ayahuasca. It's christened as daime. And then they do prayers, you know, Our Father who art in heaven, and, you know, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, Hail Mary, full of grace. And you're still having these beautiful, transformative experiences, but most of the visual terrain, the archetypes showing up, tend to be Saint Michael and Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, of course, you know. So that's very much Ego Condor. Yeah, in a lot of ways, the Santo Daime was responsible for bringing ayahuasca to the West. Yeah, with that church landing here, and then, you know, it's legal in Oregon, and now because of that, there's a church in Los Angeles, in Redondo Beach, that's legal. Fully recognized as a freedom of religious practice of ayahuasca use. yeah, that introduction, it made sense that it came through Judeo-Christian lens because it made it very accessible and less so crazy exotic for people. And then from that gateway, people started branching off and studying a lot of other things. Yeah. So we have a few minutes left. I want to get your question, and I also want to hear from one of the things that I'm really passionate about in terms of Eagle Condor and ceremonial practice in general is what it offers Western youth. It's something I'm really passionate about, millennials in general. And if he's up for it, just in a few minutes, I would like for you to share. David is part of our I Am Life project, which started off as a youth empowerment project. It really morphed into we're a conscious event production company. We focus on events that share the concept and idea of interconnectivity, particularly as it's related to indigenous people and this prophecy. So David's now been a part of this project for 3 years, has gone to Ecuador and Costa Rica, Peru, all medicine related. And I would like you to share what you feel it is that this medicine path and Eagle Condor prophecy offers young people.
Thank you for the opportunity to share.
How old are you?
25. So, my first ceremony was in the theme of the prophecy of the eagle and the condor. And being introduced into ceremony and path of medicine and sweat lodge, this is actually December 21st, 2012. I think I had been researching for a few years, and the opportunity came, and I went for it. And I immediately stopped drinking alcohol. I immediately had a concept for how I relate to a drug, which I was now like, what is a drug? What is a medicine? I think our culture has them backwards. What's medicine and what's a drug? And so I started walking this path and just experiencing so much transformation in how I relate to myself, my family, nature, community, and learning how to pray and connect with divinity within myself, as opposed to how our culture and dogma of religion is like God is outside of yourself, and you're really disempowered by our culture. So learning to connect with that was one of the greatest gifts. And the dream of the modern world, which you spoke to so well, is it's institutionalized all the way through my college experience. The institutionalization of racial institutionalization.
Mm-hmm.
And
institutionalized racism.
Thank you. Is it's all in the college environment, and so I didn't have much support from my own process of awakening into higher consciousness in my heart and my connection and awareness of what's happening on the planet. I wasn't really supported by anything. There's no rites of passage for the millennials right now, and so for me, when I look at what's happening on the planet, maybe one of the biggest challenges is that young people, over half the world's population is under 25, and it's the largest potentially liberatory force on the planet, and yet there's not embedded systemically within our global culture yet adequate rites of passage to support people becoming mature adults who are actually see themselves as guardians of the planet and of nature and a steward of life itself. I think that is like the most authentic, general way you could think of a rite of passage. And humanity is going through a rite of passage, I would say, from being a teenager to an adult. And so these medicines and learning how to relate to the sacred and ceremony and intentionality and how you relate with earth, it's really all of teachings about like love. And the density is so dense from so many hundreds of years of colonization and everything that it really these ways and these ceremonies and the elders and the wisdom keepers. Before that I was just like resistant to authority, and my elders didn't have any, and so it's healed that disconnection as well. With that intergenerational connection. So I think that's it.
Great. You had your hand up in the back row?
Now I have to follow that?
Yes, as a matter of fact.
wondering if the Eagle Condor teaches specifically. I've heard indigenous people taught that when people tried to collect more belongings than they needed, or were seeking out to have more treasures or more, just more, they saw it as a mental illness. And they would teach their culture about, how to share and how to live with the land. I was wondering if the Eagle Condor teaches about that at all, or if that's part of it.
Well, it does in this sense. It was Lynn Twist and a group of people that over 22 years, I'm not sure, went down to Ecuadorian Amazon, met with the Achuar. The Achuar said to them, basically, if you're here to help us, go home. But if you're here because you recognize that we have a shared destiny, right, that we can work on together, then we want to work with you. And they said, what you need to do, their counsel was, go home and change the dream of the West. Right? So the Pachamama Alliance was born, which is one of the most phenomenal organizations. I plug them everywhere we go. They do a symposium called the Awakening the Dreamer Symposium, an offshoot of that for younger people called Generation Waking Up. And they delve into all of the same concepts, ideas, and issues that come up in medicine communities, but in a way that anybody, your great-grandmother who's a Republican, can go and ideally walk out of there with the same kind of expanded awareness about not only what's happening on the planet, but how to participate and feel it, basically. Yeah, so really indebted to them. This dream of the West is what you're speaking to. One of the things I like about Eagle Condor is this idea of the heart and the mind. That either of those out of balance causes us trouble, we all know, right? To be just completely in the heart all the time, we all know that wreaks havoc, right, in our existence. And all of us have friends that are completely heady, and the trouble with that, So in the West, if the West is representing technology, masculinity, intellect, we definitely have seen where that has gotten us, this mechanistic view of the universe, basically. And it gave us permission to basically dissect and torture animals because we didn't see them as living things, we saw them as mechanisms, as machines. An indigenous person would never think that, right? Even though they're killing animals to sustain themselves, they're very aware that the animal has a spirit as part of nature and feels pain, right? So I feel like what we see in the West, it's not that we want to demonize the beauty of intellect and technology. This is what the West is giving the world, for sure, right? It has to be tempered, My teacher Russell once said that intelligence without heart builds an atom bomb and drops it, right? Pure intelligence with heart recognizes the technology of an atom bomb, right? And sees where can we apply that for the greater good. Intelligence just run amok, this is where it takes us, right? Extractive practices, and complete non-sustainability, what's happening. The front lines of the Eagle Condor right now, prophecy by the way for most indigenous people, is what's happening in South Dakota, right? Not only is it sacred land, it's protected by a treaty, here's the water source, we're all running out of fresh water on the planet, and these people are trying to build a pipeline underneath the water supply, which has broken numerous times. I just read the statistics on how many times it's had breaks in the last year. So the idea that they can safely do that on indigenous land, right, and do it with dogs and guns, right? There's so many places on the planet where we're seeing the Eagle Condor prophecy play itself out. Right? Once you become aware that that's what it is, you start seeing it everywhere. So in a roundabout way, I hope that answered your question, because I can't really direct it.
Yeah, thank you.
So last question, because we're going to have to close.
It seems that one of the hungers of the human heart is for communion.
Absolutely.
Being with each other, back to the right relationship thing.
Yeah.
The American way is make everything a Walmart experience, kind of box it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if this has potential to really exponentially increase a sense of mutual belonging, a sense of communion, not only with the plant, but with the community, and then kind of radiating up from that.
Well, I think that's the goal, certainly. Not only the Eagle Condor prophecy, but if you look carefully, this is something I've shared over the years. It's what I'll close with, besides a chant, hopefully led by Tete. What I've seen over the years is there's this art. People come to ceremony initially because personal healing, right? Whether it's this longing for spiritual connection, as you mentioned, more acutely like depression, trauma, anxiety. So that happens. And then right away, that gives way to transpersonal healing. You suddenly realize that you healing yourself is affecting your family, right? In fact, ultimately it's affecting your culture, right? Maybe the neighborhood you live in. This idea of epigenetics that was brought up, Mr. Stovall there, yeah, you start realizing, hey, wow, what I experienced in this ceremony wasn't even mine. That was my ancestral stuff. That was my experience for sure. And you start getting this sense that in ways you don't understand, you're actually healing other people, right? And that's a whole other conversation. So for me, when I started off as an activist, you know, carrying signs and protesting, and I feel there's absolutely a place for that, which Joanna Macy calls the holding actions. These people that bring attention to problems, right, and don't let them rest, the blessed unrest. But I had an epiphany that was a result of a depression, and I thought, wow, legislation and even grassroots movements are not going to cause the revolution that we need. A shift in consciousness is going to cause the revolution that we need. And I thought, that's where I want to apply myself. So for me, in my work with plant medicines, advocating them, and participating in them, for me, it's all a form of activism, actually. Literally in support of the evolution of human consciousness. That's why I'm here. I hope.
Just, you were asking about the Igbo Condor, how to integrate it. Maybe we go back to the beginning. There's a quote by Benjamin Franklin, in order to create a more perfect union. Do you know the full quote? If the Iroquois can form a perfect confederacy, then we as a people can form a more perfect union. But the Iroquois didn't have mental institutions. They didn't have jails. They did not have elderly homes.
Tony asked for a native song. Maybe we could, just for fun, because the band wants to end.
We're going to sing together.
This is a song from a local tribe, the Chumash, which starts in Malibu and goes This is oddly enough a welcome song, but it's also an honor song and a healing song for the waters. And the words, Ongua. Everybody say Ongua. Ongua. We give the rest.
We have to close out your last question. What I didn't say was, yeah, I consider what's happening in the West, our over-identification with extractive everything. It is a pathology. Clearly it's a pathology because it's the mind without the heart tempered typically leads to mental illness.
All right, round of applause again for these wonderful Well, I mean, one of the themes that I think that kind of came up for me is this is creating new traditions together.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. And what's so interesting about how the West got reintroduced to psychedelic entheogenic medicines was through LSD,
Right.
which has no tradition. And so creating, and a lot of, MDMA, 5-MeO-DMT, beautiful, beautiful medicines don't have traditional uses. And so it's kind of coming together and finding and growing traditions together, which I think is just, there's just something so beautiful about that.